few musicians can draw the listener into the depth of despair as powerfully as Franz Schubert. Yet, Schubert revealed very little about his inner life. As a result, few famous composers are the subject of as many myths and clichés as Franz Schubert. Who was Franz Schubert? What places and people influenced him? A biographical approach to the artist of the century from Austria. Vienna is proud of its Schubert, as he is the only truly Viennese composer apart from Strauss among Vienna's great composers. However, his parents came from other regions of the Habsburg Empire. They came to Vienna to seek their economic fortune. His father, Theodor Schubert, came from Moravia to join his brother and learn the profession of a teacher. His mother, Elisabeth, was a native of Silesia and was working as a private cook in a Viennese household when she met Theodor Schubert. They got married in 1783 and Elisabeth gave birth to a child every year for the next 13 years until Franz was born in 1797. At this time, the mother was already 41 years old. Schubert's birthplace on Nussdorfer Straße was located outside Vienna's fortifications with the bastions and the glacis. It was located in a suburb called Himmelpfortgrund. At first glance, Schubert's birthplace at Nussdorfer Straße 54 makes an idyllic impression, but appearances are deceptive, as more than a dozen families lived in these apartments at the time and the hygienic conditions were precarious. It was therefore not unusual for only 5 of the 14 children in a working-class family like the Schubert family to survive the toddler years. Both parents seem to have been industrious and thrifty, because when Franz was 4 years old, they were able to purchase a building on Säulengasse, which, in addition to an apartment, provided space for a school, which Theodor was to run as a school administrator on his own account. He was a passionate cello player, taught Franz to play the violin, and recognized that the son had great musical talent. He was able to arrange for Franz to receive lessons on the organ in the nearby baptistry, where he sang in the choir from an early age. In his later childhood years, Schubert also played in a string quartet at home, with his father and older brothers, and thus came into close contact with music. However, the family had no financial means to further Franz's talent in the long term. So his father planned to place Franz in the so-called Konvikt. This was the boarding school at the Hofburg. It trained boys for the choir who performed in various churches on behalf of the imperial family, including the Hofburg Chapel. The boarding school places were in great demand, as the school was free and the education was of a high quality. At that time, Vienna did not yet have a conservatory, and the Konvikt was therefore the only place where a destitute family could get a higher education for a musician for their child. However, there was a long list of applicants for the annual allocation of 10 places, and it was the director of the institution, Antonio Salieri, who recognized the talent of the 11-year-old Schubert at the audition and gave him a place at the boarding school. Salieri deserves a lot of credit because over the next 5 years, he became Schubert's most important patron and the busy court musician, composer, teacher, and director of the institution gave his pupil 3 private lessons for almost 6 years. Schubert immersed himself fully in music during these years at the Konvikt. In addition to formal school lessons, Schubert became acquainted with liturgical music as a chorister and soon played in the Konvikt orchestra. Franz began to compose on his own initiative, often taking inspiration from masterpieces by Mozart and Haydn. His first symphony, for example, was composed during this time, and he was allowed to perform it with the Konvikt orchestra at the age of 16, which was a great honor. He used his free time to compose and made many acquaintances who would accompany him throughout his life. He often attended contemporary operas, such as Beethoven's Fidelio or Gluck's Iphigenia, with his older student and mentor Joseph von Spaun. These boarding school years were therefore happy and artistically fruitful years for the budding young man. Even if Schubert is said to have once described the boarding school years as a prison due to the strictness of the supervision. Schubert did not formally graduate from boarding school. This was partly because he had lost interest in the school subjects and partly because his father called him home. What followed his return were 3 difficult years. His father obliged his son to work as an assistant teacher, as he had envisaged a career as a teacher for him. For Schubert, who only had music on his mind, this prospect was a disaster, and the schoolwork was torture. His greatest ray of hope during these years was that his baptismal church performed the 17-year-old's Mass in F major. He was able to experience a warm reception for his music in this home performance at the Lichtental Church. His decision was made. He wanted to become a professional musician. His father wanted to forbid him to follow this path, and Franz sorely missed the support of his beloved mother, who had died in France last year at the Konvikt, much to his grief. Her balancing power could possibly have helped in his relationship with his father. His father wanted nothing to do with the breadwinning profession of composer, and so the two of them slid into a family catastrophe when Schubert told his father that he wanted to become a professional musician. His father chased the young Franz out of his parents' home with the words, "You loser." Schubert now had his back to the wall. His father's reaction should not be justified here, but his fear that his son would be completely destitute was not unjustified. After all, the only realistic chance of making ends meet as a musician was a career as a highly talented performer. But Schubert was demonstrably not in singing, not on the violin, and not on the piano. Even applications to become a music director were met with no response, let alone that a publisher would acquire his youthful compositions. Franz von Schober now offered his friend to live with von Schober's family on Spiegelgasse. Schober felt it was his duty, as it was he who had advised Schubert to give up teaching. From then on, Schubert would never have a home of his own until his early death. For 14 years his path took him from apartment to apartment with friends, and he became a restless wanderer. His growing circle of friends became his family, and he already enjoyed the respect of an astonishing number of friends and acquaintances at this young age. Not least because, at the age of 17, he had already composed 2 of his first important masterpieces in the field of song, Der Erlkönig and Gretchen am Spinnrade. These songs already bear Schubert's unmistakable signature, and it is fair to say that with them he created the romantic art song almost from scratch. It's simply brilliant how he musically depicted the humming of Gretchen's spinning wheel with simple but all the more effective means in the piano part.
Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer, ich finde sie nimmer.
It cannot be emphasized enough that there were no precursors or models in the field of song, and that even Beethoven's cycle An die ferne Geliebte was not published until 2 years later. Schubert's circle of friends was extremely important for his artistic development. His friends came from the educated middle classes as well from artistic circles. Some particularly important companions should be mentioned here. First of all, the aforementioned Franz von Schubert. He was probably the closest person to Schubert, and the two of them jokingly called each other Schubert. Schubert was a poet and later also contributed text for Schubert's musical settings. It was he who sent Schubert's setting of Goethe's poems to the poet. However, there was no reply. Joseph von Spaun was 10 years older than Schubert and was already mentioned as a friend from his days at the Konvikt. Spaun was a lawyer in the civil service and occasionally helped Schubert out financially. Moritz von Schwind and Leopold Kupelwieser were both painters and later became important artistic personalities in their field. They produced some of the few important pictorial testimonies of Franz Schubert that have come down to us. The poet Johann Meyerhofer contributed the lyrics for around 50 songs and shared his room with Schubert for 3 years from 1818. The friends organized themselves partly in fraternities, but also at social evenings, where they read, played music and danced together. The circle of friends grew larger and larger, and Franz's music became the focus of these gatherings, and they were soon given the name Schubertiades, or Schubertiade in German. Schubert composed hundreds of dances, marches, Ländler and polonaises for these gatherings, to which the friends danced and sang, accompanied by Schubert at the piano. Schubert often improvised. If he liked a piece particularly well, he would repeat the improvisation to memorize it and put it down on paper the following day. One of the most important unanswered questions in Schubert's life is whether he was homosexual. There is evidence for and against it. His presumably unfulfilled relationships with various women speaks against it. For example, with Therese Grob, the singer at the premiere of the F major Mass. Schubert wanted an engagement, but Therese's father, a master baker, was against the liaison. Or his time in Selis, where he taught the daughter of the nobleman Esterhazy during the 2 stays of several months and presumably fell in love with Caroline. He enthusiastically wrote piano music for 4 hands and wrote passages in which C major and F major entwine intimately, which, according to experts, stands for nothing other than Franz and Caroline. The thesis in favor of homosexuality is supported by the fact that several close friends were possibly homosexual. For example, Johann Meyerhofer, with whom Schubert lived for 3 years in his one-room apartment on Wiplinger Straße. Meyerhofer wrote the lyrical cycle of poems To Franz, which Schubert set to music. He was later unable to overcome Schubert's death and, after repeated suicide attempts, succumbed to the injuries sustained from jumping out of his office window. What was Schubert's personality like? Let's start with a superficial but interesting topic, namely his appearance. Most of us are most familiar with this image of Schubert. It's a watercolor from 1825, and a painting that I'm sure you're familiar with is a recreation made around 50 years later. Much about this portrait seems authentic. The curly hair, the pensive expression, and the distinctive dimple in the chin. Nevertheless, it can be assumed that the painter idealized Schubert's appearance somewhat. His nickname, Schwammerl, little mushroom, indicates that he was rather chubby and probably did not have the angular features that the watercolor suggests. The drawings by his painter friends such as von Schwind and Kuppelwieser are probably closer to reality. Reliable testimony to Schubert's appearance is provided by a life mask. The picture shown on the left is the only painting of Schubert's youth that exists. It's neither signed nor dated and only came to light later. As some striking facial features do not appear to be depicted in conformity, many doubted that this was Schubert. However, a detailed examination of accessoires such as the type of glasses and clothing by experts pointed more towards authenticity. The fact that the hair was probably smoothed with sugar water and combed back was also not unusual in Schubert's time. Let's move on to personality traits. For a long time, tradition was dominated by the image of the jovial Viennese. Presumably, the sugar-coated films of the 1930s and 50s, with their images of a handsome artist, contributed to a romanticized view of Schubert the man. In reality, Schubert was described by his friends as amiable but also grumpy and gruff, qualities often associated with geniuses. This description was partly due to the fact that Schubert was a secretive person and therefore remained difficult for those around him to understand. Indeed, this leaves us in the dark about many aspects to this day. Even written records are not productive, as the introverted composer left only a few written testimonies to posterity. Much is tradition and presumably also the interpretation of his contemporaries. What does his music tell us about his personality? When we study Schubert, we realize that hardly any other composer wrote music that draws us into the abyss as much as his. And no one can escape the relentlessness that some of his works have. The pain of the soul was an important impulse for his artistic activity. A famous statement can be found in a letter from Schubert to Kuppelwieser. My creations are there through the mind for music and through my pain. The cause of the pain is only partially known. In any case, the illness brought bitterness into his life. The greatest sorrow was probably his homelessness, the lack of a home, a family, and a companion, which made Schubert a restless wanderer. He found pleasure in socializing and, of course, in composing and making music. It is reported that he even wore his glasses in his sleep so that he could capture a musical inspiration at any time. In the field of art song, Schubert remains unsurpassed. Sure, his songs do not have the monumental reach of Beethoven's symphonies, but hardly any other work of classical music has such a loyal and deeply moved fan base as Winterreise, for example. The composer Schubert felt at home in the song. It suited his style of composition. It was not the tweaking of form or thematic work that Haydn or Beethoven sought, but his works grew out of inspiration and wandering through the keys. According to his friends, Schubert was able to grasp the mood and the message of a poem in the shortest possible time and set it to music. There were many days on which he wrote up to 9 songs. Schubert's most important innovation was to establish the piano as an equal partner. As an example, listen to the beginning of Winterreise, where Schubert draws the listener into his world in an incomparable way with just a few bars of piano.
Fremd bin ich eingezogen, fremd zieh ich wieder aus.
The Winterreise is one of his works of melancholy and pain. Even more folksy songs such as Der Lindenbaum, the resigned tone of the Winterreise remains intact.
Vom Brunnen vor dem Tore, da steht ein Lindenbaum. Ich träumt in seinem Schatten, so manchen süßen Traum.
The court opera singer Johann Michael Vogel became the most important interpreter of Schubert's music. He met Schubert in 1817, and the 50-year-old devoted considerable time to Schubert's Lieder, usually accompanied by Schubert at the piano, whether at Schubertiades or at public events. Schubert's song output is enormous. His oeuvre comprises 600 songs. The Napoleonic Wars weighed heavily on the Habsburg Empire and led to a deep economic crisis. Between 1810 and 1820, even many craftsmen slipped into abject poverty. Vienna was also occupied twice by Napoleon's troops, and the already hard-pressed population had to provide for tens of thousands of French soldiers. The most difficult time came in 1816, the infamous year without a summer. A huge volcanic eruption in Indonesia darkened the atmosphere and meant that Vienna only had 30 rain-free days in 8 months. The crops rotted in the fields, and a severe famine hit the city with its 200,000 inhabitants. In view of this economic situation, it was almost impossible for Schubert to earn money with his compositions at the beginning of his career as a composer. The music publishers themselves suffered from financial bottlenecks. Even Beethoven had a difficult time selling his works. It was only with the slight economic recovery at the beginning of the 20s that his growing reputation that Schubert was able to sell some of his works at a profit. It is estimated that he earned around 8,000 guilders in Viennese currency over the course of his life. By comparison, the annual rent for a spacious upmarket apartment in Vienna was between 500 and 1,000 guilders. So, was Schubert really penniless? If you look at his lifetime income, it was many times higher than the average earnings of ordinary people. The image often painted of Schubert as a poor, penniless composer may be true for his first period as a composer, but is not tenable for the following years. In 1822, Schubert received the terrible diagnosis that he had contracted syphilis, presumably while visiting a prostitute. A cure was impossible at the time. There was only hope of a mild course of the disease. The following year, Schubert had to go to hospital for treatment and was admitted to the ulcer room. It is hard for us to imagine that he wrote important parts of the sunny song cycle Die schöne Müllerin in this repulsive environment. The treatment caused Schubert to lose his hair at times, and he wore a wig for a long time. The bouts of illness destroyed any hope of a mild course of the disease. In addition to this health crisis, his compositional work also came to a standstill. During these years, we encounter many unfinished works. The most famous example is his unfinished symphony. What triggered the artistic crisis? It was probably less due to illness than to the failure of his opera plans. Schubert literally longed for public recognition and saw his happiness in opera. In the meantime, Vienna had experienced a sensation. Gioacchino Rossini's stay in Vienna in the first half of 1822 sent the city into a veritable Rossini frenzy. During these 3 months, music lovers were treated to over 60 performances of Rossini's operas in Vienna. Everyone was talking about opera, and Schubert saw his chance. However, his two most ambitious projects, Alfonso and Estrella and Fierabras, failed in 1820-23 due to political constraints and weak libretti, which were written by Schubert and Kupelwieser's brother Josef respectively. The bitter conclusion: Schubert, the master of the lied, was unable to achieve any notable success in the music theatre with any of his 11 stage works. Schubert was devastated. He wrote to Kupelwieser, "I feel like the most unhappy, miserable person in the world." To get out of this misery, Schubert made a far-reaching decision. His goal was now to write a great symphony, but he doubted his technical ability. Even his 20s, he copied Beethoven's Fourth to practice purposes. Even shortly before his death, he had planned to continue his counterpoint training with a teacher. To get to his great symphony, he wanted to take the detour via chamber music. No longer for domestic use, but for concerts. He was able to win over an important colleague. Schubertiades, who had premiered many of Beethoven's quartets, now took on Schubert's music. What followed was an artistic flight of fancy. Work after work was created in the following years. Some dark works were created, such as the D minor quartet with its 4 movements in minor. Schubert now felt ready. He probably began work on the Great Symphony in 1825. Much is uncertain. It's possible that he completed the work the following year and sent it to the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde. But to Schubert's horror, they put it in the archives. It was too difficult and far too long. Unimaginable for us today, as this symphony is one of Schubert's most beautiful works. Beethoven died in 1827. Schubert was shocked and was one of the pallbearers at the funeral of his great composer colleague. Possibly as a reaction, Schubert now wrote his greatest piano works, the 3 great piano sonatas, Deutschverzeichnis 958-60. There is no doubt that Beethoven's last 3 piano sonatas served as a model in terms of form and structure. Did Schubert see these works as the conclusion of his piano oeuvre? We do not know. In 1828, the year of his death, Schubert was able to experience one of the finest moments of his musical career. He was allowed to organize a major concert on his own account, and it seems to have been a great success. One of the highlights was the E-flat major trio, whose slow movement with its nostalgic music already evokes a farewell mood. In the fall of the same year, Schubert fell ill, presumably due to food poisoning. The weakened Schubert lived with his brother Ferdinand outside the city walls of Vienna, where the hygienic conditions were worse. There he became infected with typhus. Due to the risk of infection, he was unable to receive visitors, and to the horror of his friends, he died of the same infection that had already killed his mother. Before his death, Schubert had expressed the wish to be buried near Beethoven's grave. This wish was granted, and he was given to a grave next to his great role model in the Währing cemetery. In 1888, Schubert's body was transferred to the Vienna Central Cemetery together with Beethoven's grave. The gravestones remained in Währing, and a copy was made for the Central Cemetery. After Schubert's death, his music went quiet. 7 years later, Robert Schumann visited Schubert's brother Ferdinand to look through his estate and discovered the unknown Great C Major Symphony. Schumann immediately recognized the importance of this work and sent it to Mendelssohn, who premiered the work in Leipzig with great success. And Vienna, you may ask? In Vienna, the C Major Symphony was heard for the first time in 1850, more than 20 years after its composition, and it was the German Brahms who did the most for Schubert in Vienna, in the roles of editor and performer. Last but not least, Liszt must also be mentioned. Franz von Schober became Liszt's private secretary for several years, and Liszt popularized Schubert's songs with many piano transcriptions, such as the famous Ständchen from Schwanengesang.